We are here to enjoy a lecture by the Director of Research and Library Sciences for the Shaker Museum, Jerry Grant. Jerry will tell us the story of the North family dwelling at Mount Lebanon and its importance. He'll focus on an interior room from the North House, which is right here in our fair city at the Metropolitan Museum's American Wing. Jerry is surely the most qualified person to lead us this evening. He has immersed himself in researching Shakers since the late 70s. He's written numerous books, he's written articles, essays, and was a one-time director of the Hancock Shaker Village, which is another Shaker community site just down the road from Mount Lebanon. Please join me in welcoming Jerry Grant.
Don't you love that face? You know, when you think everybody looks so sour, she's just happy about something. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. You know, the Shaker Museum had an event at the National Arts Club many years ago, and it's nice to be back here. I can't actually remember why we were here, but it was another wonderful evening like this. It ages me a little bit. Ray advanced my slide, which was good, and she told a little bit about the Shakers, which is probably all I wanted to really tell you tonight. I think the main point, just before we get going, there are a couple of things to sort of get going with. One is the Shakers are a church comprised of people who, for the last 2¼ centuries, have tried to live what they would consider the life that Christ told his apostles to live. This is not going to be the theological lecture, but basically the important parts are that you live in community, you share all goods in common. You live a celibate life, there is no marriage in heaven, you are now living on heaven and earth once you have committed yourself to that life. Those are the things that are going to basically the only things you need to know about the Shakers to sort of get through the rest of this, but because we're going to be looking at a building that is not a normal household. It's a household designed for people who are sharing all things in common and living a celibate life. And those will sort of, if you are informed about those, we're all set. Beyond that, Ray also mentioned the Mount Lebanon Shaker Village. And she gave you some dates, 1787 to 1947. Those are the dates during which the Shakers began their life in Mount Lebanon, New York, or in Lebanon, New York, and until they finally vacated in 1947. We're going to tell their story a little bit as we go through that. Mount Lebanon, the only thing I would mention that would be important for this is to understand that it was the first community that the Shakers organized. It was the home of the leading ministry, and the people that lived there, the Lebanon ministry, were the people that controlled what happened in the entire Shaker church across the eastern U.S. Beyond that, we go to another subgroup of the North family Mount Lebanon Shakers. The Shakers were organized into communal families. The family unit that the Shaker Museum owns right now are the buildings that are remaining from what was the North family. The Shakers would have called it the North family or the Novitiate order or the Gathering order. It had different names, and I'm going to explain those in just a minute. The North family, just to run a little bit of history here, when the Shakers settled in at Mount Lebanon, 1787, there were about 120 people who had been converted to some level of faith in the Shakers in the previous 10 years. They finally sort of were told that it was time to come together as a body and as a church. And they did that. Fortunately for us, they owned pieces of land around on the hillside in New Lebanon, New York. Enough of them owned land there that it was the logical place for them to form their first community. And they did, and they bought and sold and traded land until they had an area of contiguous land and farms that allowed them to really separate themselves a little bit from the rest of the world. From 1787 until about 1796, the Shakers just hunkered down. They had been proselytizing. They had traveled through New England. They'd made converts in most of the New England states, except those Rhode Island Baptists that wouldn't have any of it. They had missionaries in Maine and New Hampshire and communities starting in Massachusetts and Connecticut. They just drawing a blank here, thank you. So in that 10 years, they got their farms going and their manufacturing going, and they took no new members in. Little by little, people fell away, and the numbers of people decreased enough that by 1796, they had become fairly well known. People were inquiring, how can I be a Shaker? They were knocking at the doors, and they decided to open themselves up to new members. For the next couple of years, they just took new members in, put them in the house with them, gave them a room, told them what to do, and they were there. They found that to be a very difficult situation to bring people. They had been as a group and very organized for 10 years doing what they did. And these new people came in, and surprised, they had some different ideas. They thought, maybe we should do this, maybe this would be better. And there were complaints about how the Shakers had done things, and the Shakers made a wise decision, which was, we need to get these people out of our house and into a house where they can be trained. So in the end of 1799, they moved them into a separate building within the church family, which was the main family of Shakers. And they gave them some elders and eldresses to train them. And that worked a little bit, but they were still too close. 1800, 6 months later, they moved them down to a farm that was a tenth of a mile to the north of the main family. And it was called the Old North House. It had been the farm of an early convert, Amos Hammond. And they moved them down there, sent the elders and eldresses with them, and that became the first of a long series for the Shakers across America of what were called gathering orders, places where people were trained to be Shakers. So they didn't just come in and try to live with the people who had already sort of had it all together. So the North family starts in 1800, and the interesting thing about that for us in terms of interpreting Shaker history is they had some of the best people there. They sent their best missionaries, their best ministers, their best counselors, their best leaders down there, because they wanted these people, the Shakers would say, it takes good bait to catch gospel fish. And I think they sent down these people. They were good bait. If they found somebody who had some sense of becoming a member of the Shakers and living that life and bearing the cross of celibacy and giving up themselves to the community, they could hook them. They were the people that could hook them if anybody could. That was their job. So the North family functioned in 3 very important ways. One was to work with those people when they came by. The second way, the North family, because if you've ever seen this picture, which is probably one of the most common pictures you've ever seen of the Shakers, this is the North family in 1827, around that time. In their worship service, this original was called Drawn from Life. So an artist came, sat during the worship service, made some sketches, went out, drew this, and it went through about 18 editions. Anthony Imbert did the first version, and Kellogg and Currier and Ives and all those folks all did their versions of it. I think this is a Kellogg print. And the fact is, the only Shakers that went to public worship, the only Shakers that were exposed to the public were the North family, because they were the missionary family. They were the ones who were there to perform and to gather people in. The rest of the Shakers at Mount Lebanon all had private services in the afternoon. The public was not invited. So if you see a drawing of the Shakers, somebody did from life, you know that it's the North family Shakers. We know that the little short guy in front is probably David Rowley, because he was 4'11" and he was a cabinet maker, and he lived at the North family in 1827. And since the artist seemed to be doing a bit of charactering, noting things like the African American members in the back row, he clearly is watching and trying to make some point about, some reality of who these folks are. Anyway, so the North family, so their job was to put on the public worship service every Sunday morning. If somebody looked promising, they would gather them in, invite them down to their home for a further discussion and try to get them to be members. And they also did most of the outreach and the missionary work. So it was members of the Shakers from the North family that were sent in 1805 when the Great Kentucky Revivals were going on, down to Kentucky and Ohio to make converts, where they made literally thousands of Shaker converts and many communities out there eventually. Very strong movement for the Shakers. And the last thing that they did is they controlled a lot of the publications. So a lot of the tracts and pamphlets and theological works came through the leadership of the North family. So it's a very important group of people, and it gives us a rich, rich source to interpret and talk about Shaker history at that particular site. I'm done with the Shaker history piece now. We don't have to do that. When I was in, just right after college, I went back and picked up a copy of the student newspaper, and this ad was in the paper. And this is 1972, 3, sometime in there, 72. And it struck me when I was asked to do a lecture on the North House. This ad popped into mind because we're going to be talking about a building that no longer exists and contemplating it somewhat. So, and it's not Tuesday, unfortunately. It's not 3 o'clock in the afternoon. What I remember also is in 1976, July 5th, the day after the bicentennial, I arrived at Mount Lebanon for my first visit, and I stayed at a building right to the left of this, off to this way a little bit, for a week to attend a Shaker seminar. And I remember walking up in this very hollow piece of land, little green piece in there, where there obviously had been a building because there were still a couple of stones around. And it took me a little while to realize that that was the site of the North family dwelling. And I can remember standing there contemplating, what had been there. And it was still fresh enough. It was 4 years after the building, or 3 years after the building was removed, that I took pictures. I remember took pictures of a couple of pine trees because they had been cut up the side because they had been too close to the building at one time. And it was the only way that I could get a sense of the scale of the building was to actually look at the tree and say, that was a big building. Well, in fact, it was a big building. This is the North House as it appeared right at its peak. And looked like that we'll see what kind of shape it was in when it was torn down. But the little pine tree on the back right-hand corner is the tree that I took the picture of in a much younger version. You can see how close it was to the house. You can see why they cut the branches away, and it all starts to make sense. And you can still stand in that spot and be between 2 pine trees where you really get a sense of the size of this building and how close it was to the road and the whole location. So for the history of the building, well, let me just actually go this way for a second. If I was just going to pick a Shaker dwelling house to talk about, it probably wouldn't be that was my first reaction, is it wouldn't be the North House, because it's not extraordinary in terms of architecture. There are magnificent Shaker dwellings. I'm maybe going to show you the ones in the west, which really got quite exciting. This is the church family dwelling house called the Great House. And it's pretty basic and pretty typical. It was a gambrel roof house building built in 1787 that got tripled in size to look like it did. And this is the church family house. You can see a peak of a curved roof behind it. That's the Shaker's meeting house at Mount Lebanon. This was sort of the model for Shaker dwellings. Basically big, lots of windows, double entrances, goes on and on. So this is 1824 that this building takes this particular form. 1830, the Hancock Shaker buildings built a substantial new brick building which still stands. There are about a dozen Shaker dwelling houses that still stand in the U.S., so you can go into these buildings. The brick, this is a fabulous building. The interior is remarkable, and it is a testament to Shaker architecture, I think. But to outdo it, the Enfield Shakers in Enfield, New Hampshire decided to build of stone. And this building was begun in 1834, and little by little it got done about 10 years later, but the Shakers had moved in, as many of us did, into houses that we didn't finish yet. This building, right now, there are people that are doing major renovations to return the interior of this building to what it was like originally. Many, many pieces that have been ripped out and destroyed or being replaced, and they've done incredible research on what's going on up there. It will be one of the terrific restoration jobs, I think, in terms of restoration isn't probably the right word because there was little left there, but reconstruction jobs to make it right. So they're fabulous buildings, but the North House has all the elements that we need to talk about Shaker buildings. The first depiction of the North House is on this map from about 1832, and doesn't tell us a whole lot except that this is what would have been called the North House as it was built. The first, when the Shakers moved down to the site, they moved into what was called the North House, but it was quickly called the Old North House when the new North House was built in 1818. And so what we're looking now is the first structure built in 1818 as sort of a fully functioning Shaker dwelling house. The other one had been a farmhouse with some additions put on to accommodate the Shakers' need for a larger kitchen and for a meeting room so they could have private family worship services. So this map is important because you can see the similarity between this and what was down the road at the church family, just a big, massive gable roof building. So 1834, 35, the date of this map isn't for sure. And lucky for us, in 1856, Benson Lossing, who drew everything and traveled around and did that, came to Mount Lebanon and did a series of watercolors that are now at the Huntington Library. And one of the things that he did was a wonderful drawing of the North family. And what you see, what happened with the North family is so 1818 they built this house. It's really not adequate. And at that point they made the same mistake that the church family did. When they got new members, they let them stay in the rooms next to the people who were the members of the North family. Not everybody there was a member of the novitiate order. They weren't new people, they were old people, they were training people, so they had to have a full family of people living there. And what happened was that those people were rooming next to them, and they caused the same trouble there that they'd caused at the church family. They didn't learn from that. And so in 1835, the Shakers built the building immediately to the left, the one right in the middle next to the timber frame structure, and that was called the second house. It was for visitors, new people coming in, and for the sick members of the North family. So it was an infirmary, a visitor's house, and where new members were put up so they weren't right underfoot with the rest of the people. So in 1835, that took some of the stress of a growing Shaker church. They were doubling in membership about every 10 years at this period. So they had plenty of people coming and going. And so we get a glimpse of what the North House looked like in 1856. And you can see what happened is that even after it's a little different than the map. It has more chimneys, and we can't see the important part of it. But what happened was that the second house took up the problem for a while, but the Shakers were continuing to grow in numbers, and they needed to expand, and they felt a totally inadequate meeting room for worship with the number of people they had. The meeting room in the old house had been basically a bedroom that had been sort of cleared away, and they could meet in there. So they put a 40 by 42 foot addition onto the north end, the end that we can't see on the other side of this building, and rearranged all the chimneys so they had extra kitchens and more of a baking kitchen, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But we do have at least Lossing capturing for us what the building looked like at that time period.
Where's the great stone barn in that picture?
It would be straight back if you just went.
Next year.
You can't see it there?
You can't see it there.
Okay.
Actually, it's too early.
It's too early.
It's built 3 years later. So I had mentioned that building, sir. Get a sense the chimneys are extraordinarily tall in that building. The first photograph that we have of the building shows the building after its last major renovation. The Shakers were in need of more space, more storage. As you get older, you get more stuff. You need more attic space, more clothes, more closets. We all know this, right? So, as you can see, the building with a big flat roof in it, and this renovation was done in 1863. The Shakers basically flattened the roof, adding 2 rows of windows, a fairly large attic space down the middle, and these little squatty rooms that we would have to stoop to walk around on the sides, but it was for hanging clothes and these big laundry cupboards, the linen cupboards that we will see later, or will be illustrated later. The date of this photograph is 1870, and we know the photographer, we thought the photographer first started shooting there in 1870, 71. What is interesting about this, and I'm somebody who just sits and looks at photographs forever with little magnifying glasses. The interesting part of this, and I'm sorry, once you blow it up on the screen, you see this little structure right here? This is a pick, or a painter's scaffold. And almost every building in New Lebanon has hooks mounted up near the soffits at the top of the building, on which you can hang ropes, which would come down and hold the scaffolding for painting. They painted these buildings about every 7 years. You can go through the records and just see, you know, they wanted them to look nice. Sometimes they only painted the street side, but they wanted them to look nice. So what we have is, in the journals, we have that they're painting the North House in 1870. And it's pretty clear that that's what's going on when the photograph is taken. So it's a nice document. The other piece I'm just going to mention to you that is just bizarre to me, and I don't quite understand it, but a little structure up on the top. In 1866, they put a veranda on the building. And I'm picturing the Shakers up there sunbathing or, you know, having tea in the afternoon. It just doesn't click, but that's what they said. Put a veranda. They don't mention where, but that's the only thing that looks like a veranda on the whole building ever. So I want to do a grand tour of the building, and this I will try to make this not tedious by making slides go really fast. But if you walk around behind the building, this was the dooryard, the back dooryard, and a photograph that was taken probably in the 1880s. Shakers just posed carefully, looking like they're doing something important. I wonder how long the guy held the wheelbarrow for the photographer to get the picture. You always wonder. So luckily, we have a lot of documentation for the building. The Historic American Building Survey measured the building in 1939, 1940, did plans. They're fairly good, and they took a number of photographs. You can see a lot of those. And then we have some casual snapshots, and then we have 2, because the North family was public, if you wanted to be a photographer and you were going to go around and take your bunch of Shaker pictures so you could sell them in your store or sell them to somebody who would sell them in the store, you would go to the North family. So luckily we have a lot of commercial photographers that went to the North family to take pictures. And some of those happen to be of the North family, luckily. So this is the basement, probably the most important single room in any house in terms of structure and understanding how that and the attic, how the building actually worked. What we have here is a basement that is almost totally dedicated to food, which is sort of remarkable. But you would have had probably 50 to 60 people living in this building. And we'll just go through quickly. So, you know, clearly the general dining room is located down here. And this is about an 1880s photograph of the interior of the dining room. These great long Shaker tables, and you can see here that the tables are set up, and those little trays in the middle, they're set up in squares of 4. The Shakers ate in silence. They would kneel before meals, say a prayer, sit down and eat in silence, so that the sisters who tended the people eating would have served up everything you needed to complete the meal at each square of 4. So that you didn't have to ask to pass anything, you didn't have to ask for anything. In fact, these tables probably have little drawers at each square, so if you dropped a fork, you could just open the drawer and have the fork handed to the person without any kind of question. There's a 21-foot dining table in Maastricht right now that was taken over there, and it has the runners to hold the drawers. The drawers are missing from it, but 21-foot table held 20 people. There are 5 sets of drawers that went down that piece at one time. So the dining room, the main kitchen with its pantry and scullery make up a unit where most of the regular meals were cooked. And the kitchen was a fairly modern thing. The Shakers bragged, and this photograph on the back of this is called on the back that this is our new stove made especially for us in 1873. a couple of sisters working in the kitchen. I just want to point out, I'm going to tell you who the sister on the left is. You don't need to know any other sister, but the one on the left is important. Her name is Mozilla Gallup, sometimes called Mozilla Gallup. But nobody knows how to spell her name, so it's spelled every possible way. But just take a look at her and remember her, because you're not going to see her again. So there's also the bake room. So there's a special bake oven. We don't have any interior photographs of that, so we'll move on. But it had a baker's buttery, so a little complex of things. Probably one of the more interesting is the canning kitchen or preserving kitchen. The Shakers called, I think, the canning kitchen. And it had a preserver's buttery. And the canning kitchen was interesting. It had these large set kettles for cooking down tomatoes or whatever, apples or whatever you're going to be canning. It had a large sink. The sink I will mention when I know where pieces are. The sink is in the collection of the Shaker Museum. And it had a dumbwaiter, which took things from the canning kitchen down one floor to a sub-cellar, sub-basement, where there were large stone benches where you could store all the canned goods. So this was laying up stuff. One of the, I do want to go back for a second. I didn't mean to do this, but I just want to notice in the canning kitchen, on the upper part of that, there's a doorway that comes in. So you think about how these things are used. If you have people bringing in quantities of tomatoes in the garden, you don't want them coming through the rest of the house with wheelbarrows full of things to be canned. So it had a special doorway.
Gary, are those drying racks in the sink?
I think so. I do believe. Oh, this is what I hate. This is the next piece is a larder. The Shakers actually call this a cooling room, and this allows us to talk a bit about some of the innovation in the building. These are pipes that came through, 7 pairs of looping pipes that come through that are fed by a spring that's almost 2 miles. The spring is almost 2 miles away, and they ran the water down through a series of aqueducts, usually in cement pipes, as deep underground as they could get it so that it arrived on site still chilled. And they ran it through the house. Once it kept this room at a good temperature, it sort of replaces the ice house, which they had in this space for a while. This seemed to be more predictable in terms of its ability to keep cool. And these would drip out, as the water dripped out little by little down into the tank. The tank is where you would keep your crocks full of butter and things that you wanted to keep cool. And then once that had an overflow, that overflow went and joined the general drain of the building. The drain with all of the kitchen waste all came together and went down about another 200 feet to the orchard where it was dissipated to use as fertilizer. Very clever, good stuff. So in addition to all of that, if you just start up at the upper left-hand corner, there's a special dining room for farm help. They were not Shakers, they didn't eat with the members, and they have their own private doorway. They don't want them mixing with the membership. So the farms, they had a little visiting friends dining room, so if you were family of a Shaker, you came and wanted to have a meal, that was the space. I think that's a late innovation. As you go down straight across, you'll see a waiting room. The Shakers would gather when the first bell rang. If you go to the Shakers at Sabbath Day Lake, Maine, they ring the large house bell at 10 minutes before the meal and then a small bell at time to go into the dining room so people can gather and get themselves settled down and then go in. That's a tradition that's gone on for as long as I know with the Shakers. So that was the sisters' waiting room on the right-hand side. I'm sure the friends' dining room was the brothers' waiting room at one time earlier. But when you got down to 2 or 3 brothers, it wasn't worth having a special room. And they turned it into something else. The sub-basement at the top was excavated under the building in 1866, and they installed there both storage for coal and a coal boiler, so that in 1866, the Shakers are heating this building now. Instead of with wood, they're heating it with radiators and steam heat. If you look up the history of radiators in America, it's a really early use of them, especially for a building of that size. Within a decade of when anybody was using radiators for heating. The waiting room, there's a little spot on the bottom where it's for ironing linens for the tables. So really functioning, room. As you went up the sister staircase, I just want to note that both of these rugs that are on the floor here, they're sort of are L-shaped rugs. They're both in the Shaker Museum's collection. One of them we brought to New York City for an exhibit we did at the Payne Weber Gallery years ago. You go up the staircase to the first floor, and on the first floor you find basically a couple of rooms that were retired rooms or bedrooms for brothers and sisters, most notably for the deacon and deaconesses' rooms. These are the two people, two deaconesses and two deacons, that really run the family. They're the temporal, the people that make sure there's enough food, there's enough furniture. If you break something, they would be the people to make sure who got it fixed. They're the really nuts and bolts people of the Shaker family. And there's always two men doing that because they split this whole thing. We don't have a lot of interaction across the sex line. The most important The most important room here is probably the meeting room or the chapel. This is what they really wanted when they added to this building. They wanted to make sure they had a new meeting room. And the meeting room here is large enough to accommodate the entire family. I want to start pointing out once in a while, the Shakers were particularly concerned when I talk about them being progressive and innovative and modern. Even in 1866 and before that, they were very concerned about air exchange in their buildings and ventilation. Every visitor that came and stayed in this building talked about how much of an effort they made to have fresh air in the buildings. They would often have the windows open, at least just a crack even during the winter. They would always pull their bedding fully back to the bottom of the beds. The beds could air for a couple of hours before they made them. There's just a lot of traditions among the Shakers. And I think with 60 people living in a building, things like cholera epidemics and people getting sick en masse, they just were aware that it was good to keep an air exchange going on. So you see little movable transoms above a lot of windows. In this one on the benches, you see that little diamond shaped that goes all the way around the room. In fact, what happened, my guess is that when they went to coal heat, they did not need all the chimney flues that they had originally, and they ran some of these into some of the unused flues. They ran ventilating shafts so that you were always having the chimneys, as wind blew across the top, would suck bad air out and up the chimney. So they were getting it was getting the bad air out so that when they would open the windows, the good air could come in easily. Just a note on the wall, just because I haven't mentioned people very much, there are a couple important. The portrait on the wall is Elder Frederick Evans. He came to the Shakers in 1830, became an elder in the 1850s. He's the one who's responsible primarily on the male side for shaping the North family in the form that we have it now. And he was probably the best known Shaker in the world. He corresponded with about 20 different newspapers. He's extensively published, and was sort of, Elder Evans was sort of the person that everybody checked in with if they wanted to write an article about the Shakers. I'm guessing on the wall to the right would have been his counterpart, Anna White, or earlier, before she died, Antoinette Doolittle. And between the three of them, they were the ones who really formed both the Shakers' physical environment at the North family, but also they were the proponents of the social gospel that brought the Shakers out into the world like had not been done probably in 50 years before they got into leadership positions. So they were attending spiritualist meetings and peace movement meetings and women's rights movements. And they were very active in the outside world. On the second floor, the only thing I really want to mention, well, the first thing to mention is the elders and eldresses who live in the building, they're living right square in the middle of the building. There's almost, just visibly get a sense that they are on the controlling spot. They're in the middle height, in the middle depth. They are the people who are responsible for the spiritual well-being of the family. So the deacons take care of the temporalities. The elders and eldresses are the ones that wrestle with all the spiritual problems. So if somebody's getting weak in the faith, if somebody is thinking they're going to leave, the Shakers would say, Elder Evans labored with him to find a new gift, see if they couldn't get them to stay. So they're key because they're located in a place where they know everything that's going on. a lot of these rooms, because the Shakers by the 1880s, when we start getting photographers going into these buildings, they had fewer people, they had repurposed a lot of the rooms. So this one room in the dwelling had been turned into a sewing room with Anna White on the right and a couple of other sisters there. So some of these rooms were no longer bedrooms, and they got converted. They had a music room and a library. The funny thing about the Shakers is if you came to look at Shaker furniture inside these buildings, you're not going to see it, because when the photographers came, they took them down to where all their nice new furniture was, all their stuff they got from Eastlake, or wherever they got that. They wanted to represent themselves as a thoroughly modern church. They didn't want people to come and go, although they hated those articles, the quaint and curious old-time Shakers. That title, I'm sure, just drove them nuts. So they would take them to the room where they had some pictures on the wall, and they had, the new furniture. There are two flying staircases in the dwelling that both led from the third floor up to the attic. This one is in the Shaker Museum's collection, and is, interestingly enough, probably one of the best traveled staircases in the world. We had lent this to an exhibit that's been to Seattle, for an exhibition in Seattle several years ago, and right now it's being loaded on a truck to come back from Rockland, Maine. So it's been coast to coast at this point. And originally, for the first 50 years of its life, it never traveled more than 12 miles from home. So And this is on exhibit at the Tang Museum, so it's been to Skidmore. We don't know where it's going next. And they popped up into this attic space. And the attic, as I mentioned, the attic was for linen and clothes storage. I just wanted to show you, we have one of these in our collection that's impossible to photograph because of where it's stored. And we've never photographed it. These double sort of linen chests, there would be 12 of these double units in that upstairs hallway in the attic. So this was major storage, and this is one of the reasons that they increased the height of the building so they could have more storage. One of the stories that may or may not be true, but because there's only one of these that I know of, and that's in our collection, is that these were all taken out of the dwelling by the person that owned it. We'll get to that in a minute. And stored in the Great Stone Barn, and the Great Stone Barn, of course, burned up and all of those with them. So whether that's true or not, we will probably never know, except these don't show up anywhere. You would think there would be others, and if they hadn't been destroyed. And not the veranda, but the piazza. So, after all of this, there was a place to take a break. This seems like an odd shifting of gears here, and I'm just skipping about 40 years of Shaker history, in which mostly the Shakers at the North family just lived there. They didn't do a lot. They were decreasing slowly in membership. They were getting involved in, Shakers quit their sort of public worship in the early 1900s. They were starting to go to church at local churches. They were having ministers come in. They were listening to the radio, to radio church services. It was just a very different life than what we expect. And I'm moving into the endgame story now. And I'm showing Burton Boucher and Ian Forrester. And why these guys? Well, on April 14th in 1947, these two show up at the front door of the North family dwelling house. Now the story is Forrester had never been to America. He came over in early April and he wanted to see America. Never been here, I want to see the country. So he had an appointment to go to Harvard to lecture. And how do you get to Harvard? Well, you go straight north to the Shakers and then take a left. That's how you do it. So somehow in that process, he went up the Hudson River, I'm sure to see other things, Frederick Church. I mean, there's a lot of things to see at that way. And then headed off to Harvard. Well, Boucher was appointed to do an article on Forrester's visit to America. So he accompanied him, he did his article on him, but they both showed up at the Shakers. Now, the interesting part of this is Forrester seemed to be cranky about something, and I think what he was cranky is he didn't find the America that he had expected to find. He said, in fact, America is a dream that got bogged. And I think he thought that, we had sold out to industrialization like England had, and we were going to be no different than them, whereas before we had been sort of this, pristine, wonderful country where we weren't buying into all the evil that was happening in his own country. And he found that to be not true, and he was cranky. So he got to the Shakers and he found the same thing. He had some preconceived notion of what the Shakers are going to be like. He found them not to be the 1830s and 40s Shakers that he had expected from reading articles about them, but rather they were just the same. He talks about the two sisters who were snapping toilet paper on the floor to make their pet canaries jump, and he talks about Sister Sarah Collins, who is running around chasing the men. She's 94 years old at this point, I think, and happy about there being so many men in the building. He just goes on and on about the whole thing. Roche, on the other hand, goes away. Forrester goes off to Harvard, and he comes back and spends a day with Sister Jenny Wells, really walking all over the property through the dwelling house. Forrester deals with the myth of the Shakers. Roche deals with the people. And this becomes the dilemma for, they both write articles. The article that Roche writes is really quite wonderful to read. It was published in the New Yorker in 1947. I don't remember the year, the issue. But he really, some really touching moments with the Shakers and his understanding. He's very young at this point. He's a new reporter. He's not yet made his name for himself. But the dilemma that is posed by this is there are 7 members living there. Let's get familiar with them. These are the last 7 Shakers to live in the North End, the last 7 Shakers to live in New York. And you can see they're all elderly. They have all, in fact, been Shakers most of their lives. So these are not new converts. These are not people that came in their 60s and as a nursing home, which is what some people had chosen to do. It's a place to go live out the rest of your life and be taken care of. But these are people that, in some cases, Jenny Wells, the last one on the left-hand side, had lived at Sodus Bay, at Groveland, at Community Watervliet, then moved to Mount Lebanon, and eventually moved to Hancock. She'd been a Shaker in 5 different Shaker villages. And most of these Shakers had been someplace else or at Lebanon their whole lives. They lived the life of the old-time Shakers. They were the people that Forrester, had he talked to them about what their life is about, he would have had a very different feeling. But he just looked at them, looked at the buildings, things are falling down, and walks away and writes his critique. But that's what the ministry is looking at the North family, totally unviable. The buildings are in terrible condition. Things are falling apart. They're pumping money into the thing just to keep their roofs from leaking. And yet they've got, on the one hand, they can't afford to keep this place going. And on the other hand, they've got people who are totally dedicated to the faith. Well, how do you resolve that? Well, the next picture tells it. They're gathered in the lawn to wave goodbye. I mean, really, this is sort of, by the end of 1947, they've been told to pack their bags. They're all going someplace else. Most of them moved to Hancock. Some just directly into nursing homes, and that's the closing of Shakerism in New York. Those folks packed up October 1947, and it was done. Let me go back. This is confused me, if not you. So the Shakers now own 400 or 500 acres of land. They have previously sold the Church family, the Center family, the South family, the Canaan families. They already sold all but the North family to other individuals. They sold the church to Darrow School, run as a prep school. They sold the second family to a private, Avery Robinson, a private person who built his country estate. The South family to a man named Jerome Count, who started a teenage work group there. And the Canaan family became an industrial farm for boys. So, all these properties have been sold, and so they had this 400-acre parcel, probably at that point about 14 buildings, and they decided to put it on the market. So, 1948 or so, you start getting ads. People are starting to hear the property is going to be for sale, and there's a lot of inquiries. The Hutterites want to come there from Iowa. They are inquiring. They want to buy the property. The Shakers read about the Hutterites, and they write back to the Hutterites and they said, we don't think you'll like this place. You guys are very quiet. You like a serene life. This is right on a main highway, and there's a boys' school down the road. It's not going to be pleasant for you, so they denied them purchase. Darrow School, the school that was next door, of course, was interested in acquiring the property. They even drew up plans for how to move buildings, what buildings to tear down. how to make a quadrangle by moving a building back. They had all kinds of blueprints for the plan. But in the end, the Shakers wanted $75,000 for the property. Darrell said, "Oh, we can't afford that." They couldn't raise the money. They proposed that they pay the Shakers $3,000 a year for 25 years with no interest. And the Shakers said, "Nah." The Shakers are really good at the finances. They didn't realize how good they were, but they said no. It takes until, in fact, I think all of these Shakers are dead by the time that the ministry finally sells the property. Maybe one or two are still, but they're just hanging on. And so they sell the property. They actually don't sell the property. They have a lease purchase agreement with a man named the Reverend Bill Vogt. And Bill Vogt is somebody who works for the Crusade for Christ in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. They were wooed by the idea of him opening up an orphanage and school for up to 500 young boys who didn't have homes. So Vogt puts out this stuff saying, "Help save a boy, Lebanon Boys Village, Crusade for Christ," and he lays out plans for how they would use all the buildings. And you have in the middle upper right hand, you see the dormitory that will hold, the two dormitories would hold maybe 500 boys. It seems like a nightmare. Talk about ventilation problems. And all the other buildings, he has, craft buildings and an auditorium. He talked about how the big stone barn, if you put a neon sign on the top of that said, Crusade for Christ, you could see it all the way up and down the valley. He had such fabulous plans. So he needed $50,000. And he asked his people to pray to send money. They apparently prayed, but they didn't send money. And in 1963, he goes into a foreclosure. There's eventually a long fight with the Shakers. There's a long legal battle. There's an auction, and a man named Hugh Spawn buys the property, and then Vogt refuses to leave. And that ends up in the Supreme Court in New York. Eventually, Vogt is evicted from the property, and Hugh Spawn takes possession in about 1963. Well, Spawn turns right around soon after. He bought the property for $37,000, turns around and basically gives it as a tax donation and a little bit of money to Darrell's school, keeping all of the land for himself, but giving Darrell's school the property. He kept the barn, this great stone barn, and he kept, I think, about 350 acres of land and gave the rest of it to Darrell. Now, Hugh Spawn was an engineer at GE, at General Electric, and his son had graduated in 1961 from Darrell's school, so he had a connection. However, so Darrell's school finally in 1963 ends up with the property without paying their $3,000 a year for 25 years. And they start using some of the buildings. So several of the buildings get put together: an art center, faculty housing, dormitory. Let me get rid of the... but the North House just sits there. They have a plan that it could be turned into a dormitory, doesn't materialize. And between 1963 and for the next 10 years, the building really just sits there and deteriorates. And you can see, just a little sense of what we've got here. We've got the siding starting to come off. Somebody's taken all of the blinds off of the building. If you look at the pictures, it just gets even worse and worse. I try not to show you all of them. The interior, there's leaky roofs. You start seeing things falling apart. Plaster coming down off the walls. And yet, there are interesting artifacts still in place. There are parts of the building. There are built-ins, there are radiators, there are doors, there are these little ventilators. And I have to just point out, this one ended up in the Shaker Museum's collection and is now on exhibit at the State Museum. If you go to that exhibit, you'll see this ventilator in its museum mode. And in 1972, September 1972, the Great Stone Barn burned. Everybody is in agreement it was arson. 3 o'clock in the morning, smell of gasoline, barn goes up, they can't put it out and it burns. Darrell's school gets very nervous about, the barn was 200 feet away from their closest dormitory. The North Family dwelling is about 30 feet from their nearest dormitory. They get very nervous, and there is an arsonist in the area. The great Tilden factory, Samuel's relatives. The Tilden factory was burned up. It was owned by Hugh Spawn as well. He was also in foreclosure on the property. We don't know who set the fires. However, the Great Stone Barn burned, and Darrell made a decision to take down the North family dwelling house. The story is, and I don't ever quite get this, that they didn't decide until the fire to tear it down, although there were discussions with both the Shaker Museum. The staircase that you saw in the earlier picture was purchased by the Shaker Museum and taken down before the fire. Negotiations with the Metropolitan Museum of Art started, I believe, before the fire, but we'll have to get that straightened out sometime. And the room that is now at the Met was scheduled to go there prior to the decision to tear the building down because of the fire. So I'm not sure that that story that we hear all holds, but someday we'll continue on with that. The barn was a total loss, scared everybody to death. So in 1972, 73, Darrow School, 1972, Darrow School decides to have a sale of all the things that they can sell out of the building. There are 182 lots. It's a sealed bid auction. It ends in January of 73. And everybody put in their bids, and if you look at, I have some photographs taken by a Darrow School student named Michael Floman, who was then a photographer in Montreal, now lives in New York City, a good friend of the Shaker Museums. He, as a student, took pictures for that catalog, and some of the prints from those I have in the collection. Anything with tape on it, like this radiator, came to the Shaker Museum. So, you know, as people bought stuff and then they had to remove these. These are the radiators designed by Elder Frederick Evans. And he designed them at a time when there weren't a lot of radiators around to copy, but he wanted one that was easy to clean. What he had seen with these sectional radiators is you can't get the dirt out from the middle of them. So if anybody's ever lived in a house where you try to paint those or whatever, he solved the problem really honest. So it was this big, huge, it looks like a landmine or something, this round thing, and they're incredibly heavy. We have these two in the collection, and I really hate moving them. But we do that. So, you know, the Shaker Museum bought things, Hancock Shaker Village bought things, other institutions and private people bought things. A lot of people bought stuff they didn't know what to do with. It keeps coming back to me. I have to tell you, last summer I received about, 150 feet of just stair banister that somebody had bought at the auction. They always thought they were going to put it in their house, and then they didn't. So it's back, and I added it to the other 500 feet of banister. And this particular unit may be of interest. It was, it's in, oops, I'm sorry. So that unit, we could see that it was starting to fall apart a little bit. This is some people from the Shaker Museum. Sorry, this is a very little photograph. I tried to push it. Removing a ventilator window from a stairwell, so that when you go around the other side, you can see they were successful in getting it out. But the building was basically being taken apart piece by piece and sold. I live with this daily. This is some of the stair rail above my desk. So we had bought some and used it to decorate our offices back when it was a gallery years ago. And so I look up at it daily. At the time, a man named Don Carpentier, who I know, always knew as the squire of Eastville Village in East Nassau, New York, what got involved, he had heard that the dwelling was coming apart, and Don decided, who was building a village, a one-man teaching village in New York, where he taught historic and restoration trades. The school still goes on, although Don has passed away now. But he heard about this, and Don said, I'm going to go over and see what I can use. There's a lot of building materials. He had been a scavenger all of his life, and a very good one. And Don at Eastville Village had been, little by little, honing his skills. He started this in high school, this village, by just banging together some A-frame buildings made out of old historic rubble that he was finding around. And eventually he had enough of the village and thought he needed a meeting house. So the little building in the front is a meeting house that he constructed totally out of remnants that he had removed from the North family dwelling house. When he built the meeting house, that he moved the one behind it and moved that onto the property, which was, I don't remember what town it was from, but it was a real meeting house and restored now. He sold off the little meeting house to one of his friends, and it got moved down the road, and it's somewhere still standing as a workshop. But lots of people in Columbia County have bits and pieces of this building. The bits and pieces we just want to mention tonight are bits and pieces that end up in New York City. I don't know how much of the North Family Dwelling is in New York City, but we know where some of it is. So this is the Shaker Room at the Met. This was opened, and you can help me here a little bit, opened in 1983, 81, 83?
83.
I remember coming to a conference when it was open.
Yeah. I think that's right.
I think 83 is, I'm going to go with 83.
Let's go with 83.
Yeah, that sounds good. They purchased this in, I think the negotiations started in 71, it's accessioned in 72, so I assume it was there by 72, which is prior to the actual auction of the dwelling house, which happens in 73. So, so there had been a deal to tear the North Family down before the fire. That's all I'm trying to say. Clearly, we had evidence. The thing I just want to point out here as we come to this is a built-in, a painting. This is from the Index of American Design. So this is done in 1936-ish. I don't know the exact date of a built-in case of drawers with a cover above and a cover on the side, a little bit of peg rail and a clean out for the chimney. So you're looking at it as part of a chimney unit there. Michael Floman, who took pictures of the interior of the dwelling house before the sale, took a picture of the same unit, or one very similar, but I would make a case that looking at the grain and the wood up close on these things, it's probably the same unit. And by this time it's lost its poles and some of the open drawers and, you know, some of the little iron doors gone, and, you know, the artist had cleaned up the wall, all those things in there. But, so we have this building, so we can see that they're probably the same piece. This is the piece that was eventually moved and installed at the Met, and I apologize for this photograph, and we're going to have better ones the next time we do this. But it's hard to see behind the stovepipe. That's when you see that it was the same form and the same piece, because remember Sister Mozilla Gallup? Well, this is her room, and it said that it was acquired from her room. And if you look in her room in this corner, you can see where the chimney comes up, and that unit was where the chimney is and down the screen. So it was built into that area there. This would be on the second floor of the dwelling, on the northwest room. I think the description is northwest room of the dwelling, Sister Mozilla's room. So we know where it came from pretty clearly. And again, just you go visit this if you haven't. You're required to go see it. I just want to end there because I think it's kind of. Anyway, just comments on this is, you know, a building that's no longer there. I have played with the frustration of a little Shaker family without its main dwelling house. It's a huge hole. So I've done my fantasies about, oh, we could have the Mount Lebanon Marriott, somebody might want to build something back that looks just like it, you know. This isn't going to happen. So for us as a museum interpreting the site, you know, we have some challenges here. Luckily, there's a second dwelling on the property. It makes some sense. But there's a big hole there. And I think so. This was my first real attempt to try to put together the history of this building because we own 10 other buildings, all of which are standing. We need to know those histories as well. And I really pretty much work on those more. But I think that this gives me hope that we can put together a story that will help fill that hole. Thank you.